Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute. I'm John Linchovsky, president of the Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce an old friend with whom I used to work in the government, Ambassador Frank Lavin. Frank has had an extraordinary career in Washington with great educational preparation. He's a graduate of Georgetown, where he got, in addition to his bachelor's, he also got a master's in Chinese language and history. He has a second master's from my alma mater, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and on top of that, an MBA in finance from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Frank has served in several administrations in a number of different capacities in the Commerce Department, the State Department, the National Security Council, and in the White House. He was served as director in the Office of Political Affairs in the White House from 1987 to 1989. More recently, he served in the Bush administration as U.S. ambassador to Singapore, where he helped negotiate the free trade agreement with that country. And then after that, he became Undersecretary for International Trade in the Department of Commerce, where he was the lead trade negotiator for the United States around the world, the lead export promoter, as well as the lead trade negotiator in our relations with both China and India. Since then, he founded and is the CEO of Export Now, which runs e-commerce stores in China for foreign companies, and he has also written a book entitled Export Now, just published a couple of years ago. He has had lots and lots of private sector experience, and he understands the various different commercial, political, and security implications of our overall relationship with China. And it gives me, without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Frank.
Thank you.
With gratitude for showing up here to IWP.
Thank you so much, John. Well, it's a delight to be here. It's a delight to visit IWP, and I sort of mentioned, John and I were just chatting in the back room for a second. It's really sort of the house that John built in a lot of ways. I have a lot of respect for what he's done here, and I was very taken by how he keyed off the introduction, because he started with that educational background, and I'm a firm believer, as he is, to say that you've got to have that intellectual grounding to be successful regardless of your profession. So it's with enormous respect, John, that I salute what you built here, and I salute the students and the friends of IWP for participating in this program and for helping continue to build it. And John also sort of elided over the fact that we met and we worked together in the Reagan National Security Council, going on a few decades now at this point. So John, this makes you Mick Jagger, I suppose. Still going strong, still performing. And if I can humbly be Keith Richards, I'm very happy at that, playing that role. So thank you for having me here today. What I thought I'd do is just lay out some broad issues about China, where's China going, U.S.-China relations, and then go to questions if we can. And I'm happy to take questions on any topic, but let me just try to set the table if I can. So the central topic is the rise of China and its implications for the United States. And my thesis is that China's rapid emergence as a major economic and political force is the most significant development of our era. And taking place as it does against the backdrop of underperformance in the economies of the United States, the European Union, and Japan, this rise is even more pronounced. And if we add to that, I think, a very important structural element that, to my mind, China is perhaps the only major country in the world that is still in the process of defining itself, both in terms of its foreign policy and in terms of its domestic role. That adds to the ambiguity of the implications of the rise. It adds just to the question mark. So it's not a country that is traditionally performed within an international state system that we know. It's traditionally been outside of that system for historical reasons, and now all of a sudden it's a major consequential power. So to my mind, the question of the 21st century is the China question. How will China define itself? How will other countries respond to that? So a brief look back. I want to just take a minute on sort of China and China history and then talk about the big issues. China spent about 30 years, from 1949 to 1979, with perhaps the worst performing economy in the world. And it spent the subsequent 30 plus years, the most recent 30 plus years, as perhaps the best performing economy in the world. So it shows you there can be extraordinary variance in this country, and not to simply reduce it to one dynamic or one vector, but it can define and shape itself. If we look at China at almost any time in the century before those 1979 reforms, we would probably find very little basis for optimism. China made this extraordinary historical journey from imperial decline and collapse to the rise of warlords, to the Republic of China era, to the Japanese invasion, to the Communist Revolution, an extraordinary amount of turmoil subsequent to that. And through that rather protracted historical moment, there were only brief periods of hope. So at different times, we saw different kinds of China. We saw an impoverished China, we saw an irrelevant China, we saw a brutalized China, we saw even a self-destructive China. But today we see something very, very different. We see a consequential China. We see a China that nobody alive has ever seen before. We see a serious China. We see a China that has climbed out of that century of misery and is in the process of building a modern nation. The fastest growing economy in the world, as I mentioned, a burgeoning middle class, more university graduates than ever, growing international political reach, and the most powerful military it's ever had. So with that background, let me touch on three themes in some remarks. First, a discussion of China's economy and its internal politics. Second, some comments on China's foreign policy. And third, implications for the United States. So first, China's economy and domestic politics. We know that China has about 12% of world GDP. That should easily pass 15% this decade. But put that in context. That means China grows by an entire France about every 4 or 5 years. Or some different figures. It means China's reserves, their cash reserves, are equal to the entire capitalization of the London Stock Exchange. In the area where I work, which is e-commerce, China's already passed the United States to be the largest e-commerce market in the world. But what's more interesting is the rate of growth. It grows, the e-commerce market grows by Germany's entire e-commerce market every year. It creates a new Germany. So this extraordinary set of numbers is not to suggest that China is a country without challenges, because China has its share of challenges. As a developing country, you could say up to 2/3 of its citizens still live in very modest circumstances. It's typically rural. This substantial percentage of the population has limited access to education or employment or health care. China faces other challenges, from environmental degradation and demographics to even corruption and all of the problems of single-party rule. And these challenges give rise to a lot of discussion in the West about the sustainability of the model. Can economic growth stay on track? Can social or political stability be maintained? And look, there's an extraordinary body of literature, and I suspect there are even entire courses taught at this institution on either of those two topics, but let me take a few minutes to touch on both. Regarding economic growth, China faces a range of macroeconomic challenges: high debt levels, banking system that needs reform, investment distortions, many efficiencies in their state-owned enterprises, over-reliance on exports, lack of competition and transparency, But what's important to note is that this list of challenges isn't my list. These comments are what's typically found in speeches by senior Chinese leaders. So there's a high degree of awareness of the challenges, one could say. I think that despite these challenges, China will be able to keep high rates of economic growth on track, because there are some very positive trends in the picture as well that tend to govern Chinese economic performance. First, China will be able to take advantage of its developing nation attributes, which means it can still achieve reasonably high improvements in output, even through marginal improvements in labor productivity and investment. So I think we're going to see that kind of developing country model continue on track for the near term, even if it attenuates a bit, even if growth rate drops from 7.5 to 7 or 6. It looks more like 7 or 7 plus this year, but it might slow down a little bit from that peak. But nonetheless, it's slowing down on a larger base, isn't it? So I think we see high rates of growth in the near term. Second, I think, as I indicated a second ago, Chinese leadership has a very high degree of awareness on the importance of keeping growth on track and the importance of economic reform. I don't think it's yet determined how aggressive the current leadership can be on the economic reforms. They've taken some steps, certainly. It's not a settled matter in my view. But what is clear is there's a broad recognition in Beijing that a status quo administration is not acceptable, that they need to continue to hone that economy to keep growth on track. Now, regarding socio-political issues, it's not a surprise that there's speculation or discussion about stability in China. I mentioned when I began my remarks that China's perhaps the only country in the world, or certainly the only major country in the world, where the social contract is still being written. Questions that are generally long settled in other countries are still fresh in China, such as what are the government's obligations to its citizens? Under what circumstances should citizens be able to criticize their government, or what role could they have in even changing a government? Well, in my view, to the extent those questions can be answered, China will enjoy greater prosperity and stability. But in the near term, I think China can manage through not having a comprehensive answer to these points, because it does maintain a high rate of growth, which promotes stability. It has gone through, I think, a very impressive wave of liberalization over the last 30 years, liberalization of political space, personal space, not political space, but personal liberalization. And it also retains a highly effective security apparatus. So all of that, to my mind, points to a high degree of near-term stability. And I want to comment in this regard on prospects for reform. China's made a pronounced move away from Marxism as an economic philosophy or as a social policy, but China remains very much a Leninist state in which one party maintains a monopoly of power. So Nicholas Kristof termed this a move from Marxist-Leninism to a move to market-Leninism. And in that context, reform means something different in China than it means in the U.S. In the U.S., when we talk about reform, we're typically meaning changing the system to improve outputs. In China, reform typically means the change is necessary to maintain the system. So I think you'd say there's a high degree of cohesion in Chinese leadership. There's a high degree of belief that the system is the right system or the best system for China, but that given technology, given globalization, given individual aspirations, some reform or adjustments are always necessary in the system. So that's, when they talk about reform, that's the context that in which we should view it. Also, let's remember that when leadership in a closed political system wants to establish latitude for action, it first typically will tend to cultivate its base constituency to reassert its credentials within the system. So it's no surprise if we read President Xi Jinping's comments as he ascended to power, and recently he's wrapping up a year in office. We see traditional orthodox comments. To my mind, that's not a surprise, and that's what we should expect from party leadership. I think we can boil President Xi's core themes in these remarks down to 3 words that he wants the entire Chinese party apparatus to take on board. 3 words. I'm not Gorbachev. I'm not going to give it away. I'm not going to give it away. We do need to make some changes, but I am not going to give away what we have built under some guise of reform or simply for the sake of improving the economy. We're going to have to make changes. We do have to keep the economy going, but I am going to keep the system intact. So that, I think, radiates from the top. So I think there are changes underway in China, but they're of microeconomic in the area of economic policy, and in the social arena, they tend to be more in the social media space driven or the personal liberty space. That has, I think, longer term implications for China. And indeed, if we look at China over the last 30 years, I think you can make the case that it's broadly made the transition from a totalitarian regime to an authoritarian regime, in which people have broad latitude for how they conduct their personal life, but they don't have the ability to challenge the political system. I think over the long run this might have implications for expectation management, but in the short run I think it provides for a pretty high degree of social stability. So you can tell, I mean, to sum up, I give China high marks, if you will, for economic management, and I'm sort of optimistic, if you will, on social stability. There might be some longer term problems, but I think not in the immediate future. Foreign policy, my second topic, and then the final topic is U.S. implications. You know, China has an extraordinary history of statecraft, of political science, of government. I assume the longest in the world. I mean, Egypt sometimes puts its claim up for oldest culture and so forth. But in terms of philosophy of government and literature involving government, I think China stands alone in that regard. But what's interesting is you look through that rather extensive corpus of literature, it's overwhelmingly oriented toward domestic governance, to internal issues of governance. I mean, all of the issues of Confucius, the analects, for example, talk almost to the point of exclusivity, talk about how to run a proper government, how to run a proper kingdom, and so forth. You know, it's an impressive intellectual work, but it doesn't necessarily provide broad guidance for international affairs. I think you can say for most of Chinese history, foreign policy simply meant border state management, which is not a surprise given that it's a continental power. Right? I mean that there's no international affairs beyond the immediate borders. And indeed, the literature that exists tends to dwell very much on that specific area. Now, in the modern era, if we go back over the last few centuries with China's contact with the West and with more modern industrialized powers and so forth, that of course changed. We had systems where China was either the dominant power and had tributary relations with some of its neighbors, or it was in decline, and foreign powers acted upon China. And so it's sort of this unusual series of sort of uneven relationships that define modern Chinese international behavior, which by way of saying is that China does not have a lengthy history of successful participation in an international state system. So this is a new era for China, where it's not only participating in an international state system, but it has the wherewithal to shape outcomes in that system. It's not a minor power, but it's a leading power in the system. I was just reflecting, John will have better historical depth on this than I do, but I think if we look over the millennia of history, that there may be only two incidents where a non-Western power had the capability to shape outcome in the international system. It would have been the Mongols, Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan, and it would have been Imperial Japan. And I think those are the only two incidents we'd see. I mean, there's all sorts of connectivity between the West and other powers, all sorts of incidents, but those are the only two times. So it's new for the West as well, is my point. It's a new role for China, but it's a new era for everybody else. Now, as China has grown in this international role, in my view, there's been many points of friction. There's been assertiveness, which I don't think is a surprise. Even when it comes to border issues, I would say a degree of truculence. China, I think now, is involved in more territorial disputes than any other country in the world. That phenomenon, combined with a sustained military buildup and limited transparency or control of the military, has given rise outside of China to questions about China's long-term goals in Asia and its ability to work in an international system. I'm sort of an optimist. I know I'm painting a picture of some concern perhaps, but I'm sort of an optimist. And here's my starting point. The good news is, because people ask me, you know, how do you compare China's rise to sort of Cold War dynamics? And I'd say I really reject that interpretation, because China does not subscribe to a global ideology or a predatory ideology. So it doesn't view itself as having some kind of global adversarial relationship with the U.S. or with the West. And indeed, if anything, some of the points of disagreement with the United States are that the U.S. State Department wants China to play a more active role in Syria or Iran, and China said, you know what, well, we just don't have an appetite for that. We don't view ourselves as a global instrument. That's your department. So indeed, at some points of discussion, we have the U.S. advocating more of a global role, and China saying we're not in that position. But there's still some interesting challenges for foreign policy management, and I think the core challenge, if we look at some of the border state issues, is that it strikes me that China at times seems to follow policies in the region that work against its own interests about cultivating better relations with its neighbors and so forth. And look, there are several possible explanations for this behavior, and it's not unknown in other countries as well. And you could even cite examples from the United States, I suppose. But I think at core we have foreign policy driven, at least in part, by domestic political reality, and that foreign policy decision makers don't always have the mechanism for second order analysis or cost benefit analysis. And what was striking to me is that given that China's an ascendant power and given the size of the country, that classical international relations doctrine suggests to us that it behooves a country in that position to defer any conflict because time is on its side, that it would seek to push off any elements of friction. So it's puzzling, I think, from an analytical point of view about why some of those conflicts are brought forward. And indeed, when you think about it, I think we have some Chinese scholars in the room, Deng Xiaoping's aphorism, I mean, he had a longer sort of aphorism, but his comment on foreign policy was Tai Guang Yang Hui, which was sort of, it's generally translated as bide your time. Don't seek issues. Don't highlight your strength. Just bide your time. So defer issues. And indeed, if you look under his leadership, what China's foreign policy was, it very much followed that maxim that they're not looking for a fight with anybody. They're just trying to focus on economic growth. Right? So it's a little bit puzzling at the shift over the last few years. That tells me that that the bureaucratic decision making isn't necessarily run on a strategic basis, but it is run on a basis that's maybe governed by domestic political requirements or domestic political impetus. So I mean, just think first. It's very difficult to see how incursions into other countries' territorial claims help international relations vis-a-vis that country, but it's easy to see how it might placate a domestic constituency. So I think it's just difficult in the Chinese system to exercise restraint that reassures neighbors. I think also China security apparatus is much more silo-oriented than I think any other country I've dealt with. So the military has a highly independent silo, and the foreign policy apparatus a different silo. Interestingly, one of Xi Jinping's reforms that he's announced is, Ralph, what is it? What is it? National Security Council. He's going to set up a National Security Council. So now, again, we haven't seen it tested or implemented yet, but I thought it was telling that at least there's some recognition to say, look, we've got to have a mechanism that makes sure that military activity functions as an instrument of state policy, right? We don't welcome freelancing, we don't want incidents, we don't want items we don't control, right? So we want all military activity vetted through some kind of National Security Council apparatus. So there's some unfolding patterns there. So I give high marks, if you will, on economic, high marks on social policy, but if you had asked me where an area of concern is, you can tell, well, there is an area of concern on foreign policy management. Now, final topic, and then we have time for questions. The U.S. role, how the U.S. can help. Look, I think the United States has an important contribution to make to the situation, and I think China and the U.S. can both benefit if the U.S. improves its reach in the region and its connectivity with China. And I'll give you a few examples of steps that could be taken to help this process along. Well, first, economic success at home. It's easier for China to take the U.S. seriously if the U.S. is perceived as managing its own affairs intelligently. So that means growth-oriented economic policies and dealing with structural issues. It means going ahead with the U.S.-EU free trade agreement. It means getting our own house in order. And I think to the extent that around the world there's sometimes articulated sort of a declinist view of the United States, I think one step that needs to be taken in Washington is to put that to rest. Second, I think it's very important to engage China on the broad range of issues where there's a high degree of convergence. And those tend to be in the economic or financial space. We're starting tomorrow the strategic and economic dialogue, the consultations that alternate between Beijing and Washington, which I used to participate in. Now the current crowd is running. But I think, for example, both China and the U.S. benefited significantly from China's WTO membership. The increased trade that came out of that. I think the bilateral investment treaty that's on the table is an important step ahead. So China has made an enormous transition by continuing to open up its economy to trade and investment, and the United States has benefited as well. So all of those steps contribute to lower inflation, better quality of life, and I would say even social stability when health and safety issues contribute. And the third point I make is the United States needs to engage with the other countries in the region, some of whom we have active treaty relationships with, others with we just have long-standing ties, but to work on trade liberalization, work on those security ties. I think we need to assure China and the region that the United States welcomes a more prosperous China, but it also supports the stability of the region that allowed for that prosperity. So my conclusion is if the next 30 years provide the same economic growth in China as the last 30, and if the United States contributes and provides the same regional stability as the past 30, the leaders of China and the U.S. will be able to look back on the most successful era of Chinese history, and it will be a very beneficial era for the United States as well. So that sums up my remarks. Now I'd be very happy to take questions. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Ralph.
I was wondering if you could comment on President Xi Jinping's recent trip to South Korea,
Yeah.
the message that it sends to the international
Yeah.
community, especially dealing with the North.
Well, I applaud him for doing it. I think it's a recognition that, look, China has historical legacy relationship with North Korea, which is difficult for them to dismiss. However, I think they are increasingly of the view that it is a vexing relationship from which they derive very little benefit. So there's sort of symbolic and historical reasons why they're connected. And Chairman Mao personally made some very prominent references, and as you know, one of his sons was killed in the Korean War.
Right.
So it's very difficult for them to walk away from North Korea. But in the same token, when you talk to friends in Beijing, they will have the same view of North Korea that when you talk to friends in Washington, D.C. They'll say that there's not a lot of value in that relationship, and they seem incapable of reform. There's enormous value in the South Korean relationship for China. There's enormous trade and investment connectivity in that relationship, so I think it's smart of him to go, and it's a lightning bolt, I think, to Pyongyang. And it's a very strong signal to these fellows to say, you know, we've tried over the years to encourage you to do some economic liberalization, and you have failed to do it, right? And South Korea's plowed ahead. So I think he's wise to do that.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. Yes?
Could you expand a little bit on points of China's role as it's changed, as it's grown economically and taking huge steps that you just mentioned in South Korea, and yet at the same time we're also seeing an expansion of beyond economic, sort of almost like military light with the port at the tip of Sri Lanka for the Indian Ocean, with the aircraft carrier that they came out with,
Yeah.
with noise making about, and,
Yeah.
you know, and it goes on, lots of little things.
Sure.
Not one major, just a little here, a little
Sure.
there.
Well, I think it is to be expected that a country that is undergoing high rates of economic growth also undergoes military buildup. I don't find that intrinsically a problem. However, I would say in the same breath that because of the size of the country and that sustained economic performance, sustained growth rates of the military, that they're going to undergo more scrutiny and even more criticism than they've ever gone before, that they've now emerged as a major power. So it's not surprising that anxiety goes up, questions go up, and so the need for other countries to better understand China's doctrine, China's budgeting process, China's acquisition process is going to spike, right? And that's very natural as well. So my advice to people in China is to say, take that obligation along with the good news you have, that you're now playing this sort of major international role, and you can send negative signals or positive signals through your military program, and you have to cultivate the diplomatic side, I think, of the military buildup. So that would be, I think, a core message for Beijing, because I would say this is a blanket statement for any country. You ought to be able to undergo the military preparation you feel you need, but not allow your neighbors to feel threatened or less secure. Now, that might be harder to do than it sounds, but that's the challenge, I think, for China. Yep, sorry, is that?
I was just going to
Yeah.
ask you one
Right.
follow on that. So when we saw the recent example by Putin in the Crimea, and then immediately thereafter there was concerns about China taking an opportunity to take a page out of that book. And then we saw the Philippines very quickly turn to the U.S. and wanting to have our presence and relations again, because I think of their
Sure.
feeling of insecurity,
Sure.
because of all these other little signs
Sure.
that have already, how would you say that China can send a message, which isn't already a message that they've already sent to everybody very subtly, that they're setting up little military markers?
Yeah, I'm not trying to understand your question. I think China is going through this rather pronounced military buildup. It's also being more assertive regarding its territorial claims, particularly in the South China Sea, but also vis-a-vis Japan. To my mind, it comes down to some of the comments I made in my remarks, that in the long run, it is in China's interest to cultivate good relations with its neighbors. And simply asserting its claims can have a cost to China as well as a benefit. And I think you can see superficially the benefit if you will have a more expansive role in the region, or you have a greater territorial claim. You think that might improve your wherewithal. Maybe it does, but there can carry with it quite a considerable cost as well if it induces ill will in your neighbors. And I would say that I guess this is the transition from narrow self-interest to what we call enlightened self-interest. The narrow self-interest simply means let's have a dynamic where I assert my claims, and even if it's your disadvantage, I don't care, I'm better off, and even if you're worse off, that's my narrow self-interest. Enlightened self-interest, I think, means that I have to have a longer-term view which allows you to feel comfortable and allows you to feel positive toward me, and my security is actually enhanced if I don't follow through on every single assertion. If you feel comfortable that we're neighbors and we're friends, then I'm better off. But we'd say that requires a little more enlightened view of international relations, and it's certainly a more long-term view of international relations. And by the way, I would say it's harder to do than it is to say. It's harder for mature countries in Europe that have been in this business for hundreds of years to do, and it's hard for China to do as well. But I think it's that point of friction that you're articulating, and that's why I'd say I don't think China has always carried out a policy that served its own interest the best, but it certainly responded to a domestic constituency that says, let's not let these smaller countries push us around. We're the bigger country. Why don't we assert our rights in this system? Right? Why we can push them around a bit. So that's a somewhat seductive voice in the system, but I think there's a danger or cost to that as well.
Good.
Yes, in the green shirt.
Yes, sir. Concerning monetary matters, do you think that China has ambitions working together with Russia, Brazil, India, South Africa to have their currency, perhaps even the precious metals backed or redeemable currency, supplant the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency for trade?
I think China has a generally low opinion of the economic management of those countries and does not view them as peers or friends. I mean, however, it views, I think, with some degree of utility, the sort of BRICS structure and BRICS consultative process. But I don't think it says I've got to be more like Brazil or more like South Africa or listen to India. I think you'd say, you know what, we are so far ahead of those folks. The economy of all of those countries together doesn't equal China's economy, right? So you say for on a symbolic level and a pure diplomatic exercise, it's worth sitting down with them, and it gives them a little bit of reach in the developing world, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't think there's anybody in Beijing who says, let's really get to the bottom of what Brazil's doing and see if we can coordinate with them on some matters.
But in terms of currency, isn't there an interest in perhaps not using the U.S. dollar for trade, especially amongst those countries, that there's a tiring of the military enforced petrodollar system, and thoughts that perhaps
Well,
their best interest is to use
maybe. I think what they're looking at is more of an insular approach, where they're saying our currency over the long run should be able to float freely and be exchanged freely, and that will definitely have financial consequences that help China. But there's also risk with that as well, and so like any liberalization, it tends to help you, but there's an adjustment process, and it also can inject some risk. So they've taken a lot of steps towards liberalization. I think they have a good sense of, we want our currency to be freely convertible at some point, but we're going to do this step by step. I don't think they're looking at any of the other countries to say, let's work with these fellas, because I don't think they bring much to the table when it comes to currency decisions. But I think that's a longer term. I think that's a longer term set of issues for them. I don't see major developments in the next few years. But step by step, where they're signing exchange agreements in Singapore and in London and Germany, and they're more and more comfortable in the international financial space, and I think they're doing a good job with it. But sorry, next you had a question.
Okay, talking about Xi Jinping's state visit to Seoul, she was followed by 200 Chinese entrepreneurs, and they received a welcome from 170 Korean entrepreneurs. Is there any onset China-South Korean alliance antagonizing Japan's economy as well as Japan's foreign policy? Consider Prime Minister Abe's recent reinterpretation of collective self-defense law.
Well, I would say this about foreign policy or diplomacy, that victory takes place at the margin. So I would say I don't think you're going to see South Korea, the Republic of Korea's change in alliance, but I don't think that's what Beijing was expecting or wanted. I think they're trying to cultivate friendship and improve a relationship, even though they know that South Korea has security relationship with the United States. But the point is, if they can position themselves better as a responsible partner of South Korea, as a friend of South Korea, at least at the margin, I think they're going to pick up goodwill out of that. So I think it's wise of Beijing to do it, even though they know there's not going to be a dramatic change in the outcome. Indeed, if you think about some of my comments, I guess what I'm suggesting China does vis-a-vis South Korea is what it might more comfortably or more to better outcome do vis-a-vis Vietnam or the Philippines, where it also has a range of territorial issues. Notably, it has only some very minor territorial disputes with South Korea, so it probably feels it has more flexibility in cultivating South Korea than it does vis-a-vis Vietnam or the Philippines. So, yes, behind you, yes, ma'am.
Just now you mentioned that China now has the biggest e-commerce market in the world, and
Yeah.
even in terms of this, it's surpassed like the United States.
Mhm.
So what do you think it means, like to the United States, like any implications to the US market?
Well, first of all, I think it's good news for China that the emergence of a middle class that is consumer oriented is, I think, a sign of a healthy society, and the fact that people increasingly have control over decisions of their personal life, to my mind, shows the government is wise about restrictions or limits it places on individual decisions. So it's a successful maturation of the modern economy. I don't know if it has direct implications for the United States. It helps us in our little business. What my business does is just helps U.S. companies run stores online in China. So all we do is represent U.S. brands and run their e-commerce stores. We partner with Alibaba and their stores in China, so it's a useful market entry point. Most people in Chinese leadership say our economy is a little distorted. We're too export oriented, and we've got to emphasize consumer spending more. And so e-commerce definitely helps with that pattern. So I view it as a step ahead, but I don't view it as a strategic shift or broader policy implications. Yes, sir.
You mentioned some of the figures that's kind of incredible, like with the e-commerce, you said like they do a whole equivalent of German e-commerce every year added to theirs.
Right.
I know Bill Gates has thrown out the statistic that people picked up about the Chinese had poured more cement in 3 years from 2011 to 2013 than the U.S. did in the whole 20th century, which when you think about it, from being here in the U.S., that's a lot of concrete. There's a certain argument, so I'm getting to the question. There's a certain argument that goes, the whole phenomenon of China is so gargantuan, so unprecedented. It'd be more like thinking about cyberspace or something, which everybody said, well, we didn't have that before, we didn't have that before. Because so much of the policy analysis is trying to say, well, Korea did this or Japan did this, you know, and everybody's trying to match trajectories. But is there an argument to be made that this is, that the approach should be to just look at something almost from scratch, that's totally new, totally unprecedented?
Look, I think you're absolutely right. That's sort of how I tried to frame my remarks initially, is to say, you know, when you think of countries that have to define the social contract in the country, I can't think of another country where that discussion is unfolding, but in China it's unfolding. I think there's a high degree of stability as indicated, but still you have active discussion about what should be permitted on a blog or social media if you want to offer criticism of somebody in government. There's space for that in China, but it's circumscribed, or more circumscribed than it is in the United States. But you know, that's a healthy trend, I would say, is that you're at least asking that question. 30 years ago, you couldn't ask that question. So this is, you know, China's society is sort of under definitional exercise right now. But my point is also is its foreign policy, that it's never. By the way, people said this about the United States sort of pre-World War II. The United States never had a foreign policy, and it never needed a foreign policy. We had two oceans. We had episodic conflicts, but there wasn't a theory of U.S. role in the world. In fact, overwhelming isolationist orientation to say we want nothing to do with the rest of the world. And so only the Second World War and then the requirements of the Cold War thrust the United States into this role. But you could say China's undergoing somewhat the same phenomenon. Historically, China never needed a foreign policy. What they needed was border state management. Right? And even today, when you say, what is foreign policy, they'd say, frankly, it's still our immediate neighborhood. That's what foreign policy is. Right? But we're in a new era where just by dint of their economic might and their growing military capability, to say they're going to be participating in this system. Yes, in the back.
On that note, do you see China growing as more than just an economic power in terms of humanitarian support, international regional support, that kind of area that the U.S. has always been historically kind of dominating in the
Well, it's interesting to watch what kind of, I mean, you're asking a really good question that I'll recast as sort of the soft power question, right? So of which foreign aid is one component, where, and I think they're just coming to terms with that as well, but where they've done, put a lot of resources and made an extraordinary effort is in the communications area and education area. So you have, for example, the state media is global and in I think 6 languages, CCTV, so you know, French, Russian, Arabic, and so forth, Spanish. So they're saying we want to get our story out. You can go downtown in DC or New York City and see China Daily, the People's Daily English language. So they're doing global information communication. Well, good for them. They should do that. They've got a story to tell. They should tell their story. I wish they'd also be more open on the receiving end to say other folks have stories and opinions as well. So it'd be useful, I think, to be a little open on the receiving end of that. But good for them. They've also made a big push with the Confucian Institutes where they're doing, things from language training, cultural outreach, but also there's a political message there on U.S. campuses and campuses around the world. So they're doing a lot more outreach on that. I haven't seen a similar uptick in foreign aid for economic assistance, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's there. I don't follow it. Yep, on the bench, please.
There's currently, I guess, an artificial devaluation of Chinese currency, and there's a thought that it has hurt American exports in the
Yeah.
region.
Yeah.
Once China starts down the timeline of a kind of free exchange of their currency, will we see an increase of competitiveness in American exports?
Yeah, and a lot of that's already happened. So Chinese current renminbi is not fairly traded. I think there's a general view that it's not correctly valued, meaning it's not at the full market value. I think that's general consensus on those points. But what's interesting is when you go to the next step, does that hurt the United States? Or in what ways does it hurt the United States? And then the final question, well, should we do anything about it? You have divergence. So if you went through the last few presidents, and even frankly talking to Chinese leadership, they'd all agree with the first few points that the currency is not market determined. It's probably not at effective market rates, and it artificially would stimulate Chinese exports, and then make it harder for American firms to compete when there's that direct head-to-head competition. I think there's a general consensus on those points. But what you have people disagreeing on is, look, if your supplier offers you a discount, is that good news or bad news? Or in what ways is that good news or bad news? So even if this took place in a purely domestic setting, if a supplier to your company or to your household needs offered you a subsidized product, should you take it? Should you penalize them? So you have a range of opinions on that point. But in any event, as you note, it's substantially corrected. I mean, now again, you have economists who will say, no, they've got to go up more, and they're not where yet. But there's been a significant correction in where the renminbi is. And if you look at the growth rate in U.S. exports to China versus the growth rate in Chinese exports to U.S., U.S. has substantially outperformed, admittedly from a much smaller base, but it's been a much higher number for several years now. So there's still a significant bilateral trade deficit. Look, I worked on these issues. I never viewed the trade deficit itself as intrinsically a problem, but there certainly were political sensitivities about it. Right? So all I can tell you is I'm glad I'm out of government and I'm selling it to China. So somebody else can deal with that complaint. So good. In the far back, sir, your hand up.
Just to add to a question that was asked earlier, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of articles in the newspaper in the Russian news about the Russians meeting with the Chinese regarding the petrodollars and moving off the dollar to the yuan and to the ruble, and exchanging the petrodollars for obvious reasons.
Sure.
Retaliatory issues against the United States.
Sure.
Is that
Yeah, but the trouble is, where, look, I understand the desire. I mean, if you were Putin, you would say, I want to minimize my reliance on your financial instruments, right? Because you're not happy with me, so I want to get out of this box. I get that. So it's an understandable impetus on his part. But I guess my response is, where are you going to go? What currency has that kind of depth of liquidity and breadth of instruments where you can park money? And we're talking about hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in reserves. So what are you going to do if you say, I'm taking US dollars off the table, but I want international liquidity? Well, if you're Putin, you're saying, by the way, I'm taking euros off the table as well. I don't want that kind of exposure to euros. So what are you left with? Australian dollars, Japanese yen, Swiss francs? I mean, there's just not the liquidity there to put that money in. So I'll say it another way. All of these funds are not invested in dollars initially as a political statement. So China, the People's Bank of China didn't pick dollar instruments because they wanted to signal friendship. They picked dollar instruments because it's the best instrument. So, but there's the point there. U.S. has to be sure to always make sure that the dollar instrument is the best instrument. Then you'll always be the recipient of the investment instruments, right? So don't be. I think U.S. does enjoy a sort of a dominant position, but don't take it for granted. Don't take it for granted. Other countries will come on stream, other currencies will come on stream, and you need to always cultivate those relationships. Good. I'm gonna go to others before I come back in the back.
Just wondering why you're not concerned about the trade deficit.
Yeah.
Because that either causes a government deficit or a private deficit, or China purchasing much of our assets. So why do you feel there's no concern?
Well, I would say it's in number, but it's in a group of numbers. I wouldn't say, what I had to deal with was the trade issues, and what I found lacking in the trade deficit discussion is the trade deficit in itself did not explain if somebody was being unfair or not, or if we had a problem to fix or not. That's what I meant about that issue. So when somebody said, we should be unhappy with China because we have a trade deficit, I said that doesn't parse with me. Maybe China does have some problems with trade, but it isn't the trade deficit that reflects it. Maybe there's something we have to fix, because there are trade issues there. But purely having a deficit, and I was just looking at numbers earlier today on the, if you go to trade.gov, I mean, if we look at U.S. trade relationships with Britain or Australia or Canada, 3 very positive political relationships, 3 good trading relations, very mature. 2 of those countries we have a free trade agreement with, Canada and Australia. Britain we don't, but it's a very positive relationship. We'd say, look, with one of those countries we have a rather significant surplus. With one of those countries it's almost even. It's almost arithmetically even. And with one of those countries we have a modest deficit. But the point is, none of us in this room would say, well, let's decide our trade policy on the basis of those numbers. We would say, that's where supply and demand led us. It's no surprise at all that the country we have the rather considerable surplus with is Australia, because they're a modern economy that just have the population base for the consumer goods and the advanced industrial goods that we make. So no surprise at all that that's where our comparative advantage is, and we ship them a lot. And their comparative advantage is, of course, natural resources, and they ship those to ASEAN and up to China. So no surprise at all, they enjoy trade surplus with many countries, but a deficit with us. But I say, so the deficit just doesn't provide a guidance to me about what we ought to do in trade policy. That's my fundamental point. Yes, sir.
As we see China emerging on the global field of economics, the question is, are we playing on an even playing field? Because in terms of IP protection, cyber theft, like allegations and other allegations of currency manipulation,
yeah.
Do you think that the leaders, as you said, they acknowledge there are domestic problems, but do you think they have the agency or the intention to address these problems?
Yeah, look, I think there are problems in the Chinese economy. There are problems, we're talking about microeconomic problems in management. There are also trade issues we discussed before. And IP is a great sort of cluster of issues. What I say to friends in China, and I think there's general recognition of this point, deficiencies in your IP regime hurt you, first of all, right? In the short run, it might help you, like any kind of monkey business, almost like an analogy with physical theft. IP theft can help the thief in the short run, but in the long run, the society pays an enormous price for it. And what China needs to be thinking about over the next 10 years, 20 years, where's the innovation going to come from in China? Where are the global brands going to come from that are China-based? And by the way, my view, you heard before, I'm an optimist, my view is China's entirely capable of playing that kind of leadership role, but it requires very strong IP protection in order to do it. So it's in their own interest to tidy up, if you will, that area. I've got to tell you, they've made a lot of progress. Made a lot of progress. I'm in the consumer space, and there's, I think, reasonably high degree of enforcement and effectiveness with a lot of consumer goods. So they've come a long way, is what you could say. But yeah, far back.
Yes, sir. My question is probably only tentatively related to econometrics, but sort of as a consequence of the economic boom that we see in China, the current government under Xi Jinping has sort of indicated that it takes the issue of anti-corruption very seriously.
Yeah.
And we've seen this with prominent leaders, Zhou Yukong or the Boshi scandal,
Yeah.
the government's taking steps in this direction. Do you view this as sort of a reform of the business culture on a whole, or do you think this is more just a political mechanism for sort of...
Yeah, that's a great, I'll tell you, I think it's very hard to evaluate this. I think there is a recognition at senior levels that corruption can be corrosive and can undermine overall economic performance, can undermine the integrity of the system. And what you see in the social media, if you look at the blog traffic and the Twitter variants, Weibo and so forth, it contributes to alienation. People, even people who aren't unhappy with the government, they don't like the idea of a nomenclature. They don't like the idea of a privileged class that is self-serving, right? I mean, nobody would like that. So even people who sound, very patriotic Chinese have no desire to change the government or challenge the government, but they find resentment at somebody who's makes decisions for them and is wealthy and just made money through something that wasn't on the level. So I think leadership gets those points. Let's say they need to have a system that doesn't contribute to that problem. How do you do it? How do you do it and how do you manage it is very hard to do. And as you suggest, some of the early big fish that they've landed happen to be political opponents. I mean, so if you're cynical about it, you say, this is their New Hampshire primary. They're just going after some folks who they happen not to like anyhow. And I'm sure there's an element of that. But the real question is, look, beyond that, what are they really doing? And I think, look, the fundamental challenge is the way that other countries deal with corruption is by looking at a more open system when it comes to communication, the media or social media even talking about it, and so it becomes self-policing, or transparency requirements that the National People's Congress all have to disclose their assets, their holdings, family member holdings, so forth. So there's other sort of structural ways that other societies do this. China hasn't done that yet. And then what they've done is they've empowered anti-corruption bodies with an enormous amount of power. But what you're saying with that approach is we're not looking at a structural solution, we're just going after the bad guys, right? So, I don't know how far that will get you. I think it's still a question of how far the anti-corruption drive will go or what kind of solution. I'll give you one example. About 18 months ago, there was a blogger who, his blog was just one topic. It was the watches of government officials, because they have signing ceremonies or ribbon cuttings and so forth, and so there's always a photograph. So he'd always take the photograph, in a public photo, he'd always take the photograph out of the paper, put it in his blog, and he'd say, here's the small town mayor. That's pretty impressive. The fellow's got a $30,000 Rolex. That's obviously good at household savings. So, so it got a lot of traffic. It was done a very, very light touch. I mean, he didn't have any editorial commentary. He just said, here's my, like a train spotter. The government forced him to take that down, which I think was unfortunate. I think that added some transparency to it. So I think they're still wrestling with where is the anti-corruption drive going to go. Yes, in the back.
My question is, how will China's environmental degradation affect its domestic economy, as well as its relationship with neighboring countries, and even with the U.S.?
Yeah, I've got some news that is unsettling for my American friends. The question was on environmental degradation. How does it affect the economy, and how does it affect its neighbors, and so forth. But I think this is unsettling for Americans who sort of, in their mind, link up this. My guess is environmental degradation in the near term helps the economy, right? No different than the U.S. Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, right? And I've had discussions with guys running power plants in China. If I can put a scrubber in my power plant, it'll take out the pollutants, but I lose 2% of my power, so what's the point, right? So, I mean, the reason, another way of saying is, the reason there's pollutants in China is because there's economic benefit to it. It's not because people are lazy or unintelligent, right? I mean, it does require enforcement. So there's an appeal to pollution. Yeah, I think no question it vexes people in the U.S. to some extent. One of the first encounters the current administration had with China was in Copenhagen over climate change initiative, and that's where China did work with India to say, we want none of your initiative. We don't buy it. We don't want it. You guys are trying to force this on us, and we don't accept it. So, and I saw Jack Liu, who's in China for the SNED, talking about climate change. I would say, I think a pure climate change discussion in China will have limited resonance with the Chinese side. However, talking about health, I think does have resonance, because governments are concerned about the health of the citizenry. So talking about pollution as a health matter, just as a domestic quality of life matter, I think is something worth talking about. And I think you'll find some traction on that. Good. Yes, sir.
Early on, you said that the Chinese economy represents approximately 12% of world
Sure.
GDP. Can you put a little perspective on that? And what about the other 88%? You know, there's a billion people in China. What about the rest of the world's population? What does 12% mean?
Right. Well, there's nobody else in double digits except the United States. So everybody else is in single digits. So it's
You as an economy?
as a percentage of global GDP, that's an extraordinary slice of world economy. Now you have to say, look, they've got about 20% of the global population, so on a per capita basis, there's nothing unusual in those numbers, but it's back to the comment the gentleman made earlier, the numbers are just so staggering when you say modern China, that almost anything they do becomes consequential. So, does that answer your question? Or?
Well, as an economic bloc, you know, how powerful are they versus European community? Yeah, obviously.
Right. So the U.S. is close to 25%, but probably moving toward 20, right, as the decade goes on. But still, above 20. So a pretty nice number. Europe's high, EU entirely 28 nations, and whatever it is got to be 30 to 35% as a group. So quite consequential, sure. So there are other groupings around that are big, but what I would say, I guess, the premise of my talk is what the EU does around the world, what the U.S. does with the EU is pretty well established after several decades of behavior, and there's not a lot of surprises or definitional work that is going to unfold there. I mean, there's evolution, but we sort of know where the EU stands as an international actor and as an economic force. But China is still writing that story, so it's a different situation, in my view. Yeah, we'll go back for a second round. Go ahead.
After and if like TTIP and TPP are passed,
Yeah.
do you think there's any hope in the near or longest future that we can reach like a multilateral agreement with China?
Look, I would favor it, but I think that kind of discussion raises right now in the United States a lot of anxiety, right? Because there's such a gap in per capita income, and so it brings a lot of fear with it. Look, but I think what we have to say never. China's already established free trade agreement first with New Zealand, then with the ASEAN countries. So it's increasingly open and an increasingly internationalized economy. And I think the leadership gets it, that's where your ideas come from, that's where innovation comes from, and that's also anti-inflationary, and it satisfies consumer choice. So there's enormous benefits to China to liberalize like that. I think we're not at the point where U.S. policy is ready for it. But it's a great question. I'd say let's visit that again in a few more years. And I think you're right. Let's work on the TPP. Let's work on TTIP. Let's work on some of these other building blocks that will also help the U.S. economy perform better. So you had a follow-on question.
I could just, concerning currencies and the notion of, the dollar not being redeemable for precious metal as it was under the Bretton Woods Agreement, do you think that, this goes beyond China, that internationally there's a sentiment that there would be value in restoring the stability of having a precious metal backing that would sort of moderate the ability of any country to overinflate their currency?
You mean as a group exercise or one country? Or
something like the first Bretton Woods Agreement, whether we would like to have a Bretton Woods II international monetary.
It's an interesting question. If a commodity-driven basis for monetary policy was that powerful and that attractive, I guess I'd say, boy, there's opportunity for a country to adopt that, isn't there?
Well, there's still, of course, gold is still viewed as an ultimate store of value, and it continues to move around, whether by lease or otherwise. It's kind of a mystery as to where it's being hidden. Like Germany asked the U.S. for their gold back a while back, and we were told basically no. It makes one wonder what's going on.
Well, that's a separate question. What I'm saying is just on your premise, if there's sort of a commodity-based or metals-based solution to currency stability, then there are enough currencies in the world that someone would say, I'm going to do that. I'm going to become the, so to speak, the gold standard with my currency, and I'll show. I mean, it seems to be a very attractive opening for a secondary country to say, fine, we're going to formally link our country to a gold standard. We're going to have this great position in the world, and we're going to follow your advice. But the fact, I mean, the point is, nobody is subscribing to this philosophy. Is my point.
Well, I just wonder if there's a inertia moving in that direction, because there's still a truth to what our founders saw, which Andrew Jackson verbalized it most clearly when we ended the Second Bank of the U.S., that the circulating money of gold and silver coin protected the wealth of the laboring class from being inflated away by corporations working together with the financial interests.
Could be. It's probably a little outside the scope of this discussion. I would just say, look, if that is the problem with economics is not that points are wrong, it's that every point is right. So the point is, I'm sure that's right, but is it 100% right? Is it always right? Is it right to the exclusion of any other point? Is it the governing philosophy of financial? If it is, you'd sort of say, well, look, why doesn't Switzerland just say we're going to outsmart everybody in the world? We're going to purely to gold standard. The Swiss franc will now be the global currency of record because the guy at the IWP lecture was right. So I mean, maybe you are right, but I'm saying, boy, it's interesting that nobody in the world, no central bank in the world is following. I'm sorry, I'm not. We can talk afterwards. I don't mind having this discussion, but it really doesn't fit into there. But I just say, for the record, there's no bank in the world that subscribes to this philosophy, is there? And if they did, according to your logic, they'd be the most attractive currency in the world.
Well, I believe both Russia and China have spoken of having a gold redeemable.
Nobody's
currency.
there. They're not even convertible. Nobody's there. So maybe your philosophy is right on target, but for some reason, not one bank on the planet adheres to it. Is all we can say at this point. Right? Sorry, in the back.
I have a question, a national security question, but more from the United States point of view.
Yeah.
Are we concerned at all about Chinese acquisition of sensitive technologies or religious technologies?
Look, how China manages its military buildup and what other countries do about it, I think, is an enormous area of interest for the U.S., for NATO, for all other countries, right? And you'd say, look, China's got modernization goals, which I think are generally understandable. But I would want to put an emphasis on saying what we should be able to have a discussion on budget and on doctrine and on force structure, right? If you're saying to us, don't worry, because these are defensive needs, these are normal needs, we're major powers. You said these numbers are huge, right? We're a big country, so we're going to have a military that fits our needs. You'd say, I understand that, but we need to get in an era now of discussions. And one of I made this point to some friends in China and also in the U.S. You know, it's interesting to me when you look at U.S. flag officers and you compare them with PLA flag officers, how insular the PLA is. Well, which is fine, we understand that. It's history, but now it's a different era. The point I made is if you just arithmetically add up the number of U.S. flag officers with two characteristics, an advanced degree or overseas service, you have almost 100%, meaning you more or less can't get to that tippy-top element of the U.S. military unless you've got some, and it might be an advanced degree, it might be a business school degree, it might be a specialized science degree, but the point is that you're supposed to, and you've definitely done at least one tour overseas, you've probably done multiple tours, so your ability to connect and work with different militaries is reasonably high, reasonably strong. That's sort of what the U.S. military does, right? We don't want you running the show unless you can plug in with other people, also run their show, right? And it's really striking to me, and I think it's not to China's advantage to say, Robert, the military is heavily, heavily insular. That these fellows spent their entire career going up through the ranks of that system. We can understand the history there, but you'd say, look, I think you'd be better off in China. You'd be better off if you had a military that had the kind of international orientation as well as a domestic orientation, right? And that's the role China's going to be playing. Good. Yes, sir.
Well, China is, I think, second in the world in GDP.
Right.
But if you consider the cost of living in both countries, as you said, the Chinese yuan is undervalued. So if you consider the real value of the yuan compared to dollar and the cost of living in both countries, would China be ahead in GDP?
Well, in purchasing power parity terms, it comes out ahead than the nominal numbers because in the rural China, you can get by with very little, right? I mean, your quality of life might be very modest as well, but you can get by. There's some areas of China which are quite underdeveloped. I mean, if you're trying to have a glorious lifestyle in Shanghai, I think it's like having a glorious life in Manhattan. I mean, it's an expensive city, right? So you know, you've got to pay for a nice restaurant, a nice apartment, but I mean, it's Manhattan, so you know, it varies a lot. Look, what you see in China, as other people made this point, you've got 1.4 billion people. So really what you have are several different Chinas, right? You have an urban society which tends to be more educated and more affluent, a little more sophisticated, and that includes the suburban community. And you've got traditional rural China where people just have much less access to education, and their purchasing power is much lower. Their ability to participate in the modern economy is much more limited. Look, all of that is changing, right? But it's a very different China in rural areas, right? You can go downtown Shanghai and sit down with some techies, you know, and guess what? All these guys, they might have gone to MIT, they might have gone to Beidai or Jiaotong, but they're very, very switched on, and you're very happy to work with them, very capable folks, right? And I would tell any young person in America today, go to Shanghai for a year or two and, you know, get involved with what's going on there, because it's a society on the march. And we built up a little business. We employ now 30-some people in Shanghai. I'd say it's a hungry society. They're hungry for success. A group of people have been sort of locked out of economic growth for quite a while. Now they can taste it, now they can have it. So it's a highly motivated group of folks. I have a very high opinion of younger Chinese. Do we have time for one more question? All right, please.
In terms of U.S.-Japan relations,
Yeah.
U.S. has been backing up Japan to reinterpret or revise.
John's got a scoop. John, before you go, I'll inscribe this because I know you got to run. But you mentioned the Export Now book. I brought one for you, so I'm going to inscribe this and leave it here.
Can you inscribe it for a library because I already have it.
You already have it.
So inscribe it.
I have to go back and look through our sales record and see if you purchased. You bought a pirated copy from China. All right. I will inscribe it to the library. Thanks, buddy. Thanks so much, John. Good to see you. Thanks for hosting. Okay.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so U.S. has been backing up Japan to reinterpret or revise its constitution without having any significant progress in TPP talk with the Japanese government. And do you think it is because U.S. government is now like hurrying to get its alliances because of the fear of China?
No, look, I don't think the TPP is motivated primarily or even indirectly by fear of China, concern of China. This antedated, APEC moves and liberalization Pacific moves have gone on for well over a decade, 20 years. So I think what we've got is a level of maturity. And indeed, I can tell you, to my mind, where Japan really switched on liberalization was after we launched the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. I participated in a lot of WTO discussions with Japan. Japan's view on liberalization was generally hostile, generally unenthusiastic. They said we don't like it, we don't want the competition, we don't want to have an open society, and as part of that, we don't want anybody else to do it either. Right? If somebody else liberalizes, then we've got to respond. But if everybody else agrees not to do it, we can be happy in a status quo. And it was a reasonable point of view, sort of from 1960s or 1970. But as the century rolled on, you say it's not a good point of view for Japan. So what really happened, I think, was when the U.S.-Korea free trade discussion started, Japan realized they run a risk of being less competitive. And I had one friend from MIDI tell me something that they had identified 70 Japanese companies that had identical manufacturing facilities in Korea and Japan. And they said, as soon as you guys implement the Korean FTA, they're just going to shut down all manufacturing of these products in Japan and shift it all to Korea, right, to save the tariff. We said, well, absolutely, that's what they should do. So why don't you join join. I mean, it was a strong motivation for these guys, and I think you needed a prime minister like Abe, I give him credit for this point, to say a status quo situation won't help us. We've got to internationalize our economy. So I don't think it was primarily or maybe at all directed by China concerns. I think your analysis is correct that I don't think we've seen an offer tabled yet that looks encouraging from a U.S. perspective, but I'd also say the U.S. hasn't been particularly forthright yet with TPP either. So we don't yet know how aggressive the liberalization will be. And look, there's a sequence here we should understand. I don't think that the administration is in a position to be forward-leaning on TPP till after the U.S. midterms. And I think Abe is waiting for the U.S. So if it is going to happen, we're only going to get clarity next year, right? We're not going to get clarity between now and November. So it will be next year, and we'll understand a little bit more about the U.S. position, and we'll understand a little bit more about the Japan position. Good. Good. Well, look, I'm able to stay around and chat and ask questions. I know people have to go. You've been a great audience. It's been a lot of fun. Talk about China issues. And I'm happy to keep the discussion going, but I know some people have to leave. So thank you for coming by.